The last thing 11-year-old Clara Jensen heard was the sound of her own scream echoing through the humid Florida night as strong hands dragged her from her bedroom window. 20 years later, the man who took her had been living just 3 streets away from her family's shattered home, walking past them at the grocery store, sitting in the same church pews, even helping search for the very child he had buried in the Timucuan wetlands. Before we dive into this devastating case that rocked Jacksonville's Riverside neighborhood, I want you to know that stories like Clara's take months of research, countless hours reviewing police files, and speaking with families who've lived through unimaginable pain. If this resonates with you, if you believe these voices deserve to be heard, please hit that subscribe button, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support helps ensure that victims like Clara are never forgotten. On the sweltering evening of August 15, 2002, Jacksonville's Riverside district was thick with the kind of oppressive heat that makes Spanish moss droop heavy from ancient oak trees. The air conditioning units hummed desperately against the relentless Florida summer, and most families had retreated indoors by nightfall. But in the modest 2-story house on Oak Street, the Jensen family was dealing with a crisis that would leave 11-year-old Clara alone and vulnerable. Clara's mother, Megan Jensen, was rushing to pack an overnight bag. Her husband had been in a terrible accident at the shipyard, and she needed to get to the hospital immediately. Clara's brother Dylan, just 15, was supposed to watch his little sister, but at the last minute, he begged to come along to see their father. Megan hesitated, looking at Clara's earnest face as she promised she'd be fine alone with their old golden retriever, Max. Mrs. Rodriguez, their elderly neighbor who often sat on her wraparound porch in the evenings, later told police she saw Clara around 9 p.m., sitting on her front steps with Max, her blonde hair catching the glow from the porch light. She was reading a book, completely absorbed, looking so peaceful in what would be her final moments of safety. Around 10:30, a jogger reported seeing a man in dark clothing walking slowly past the Jensen house, pausing to look at the windows. When pressed for details, the jogger described someone of average height and build, nothing particularly memorable except for the way he seemed to be studying the house rather than simply passing by. What happened next would haunt Jacksonville for 2 decades. When Megan and Dylan returned from the hospital at midnight, they found the front door still locked, but Clara's bedroom window was wide open, the screen carefully removed and leaning against the house. Max was in the backyard, barking frantically at the tree line that bordered the Timucuan preserve. Clara's bed was rumpled, her favorite stuffed elephant lying on the floor, and she was gone. The 911 call that Megan made at 12:17 a.m. captured the raw terror of a mother's worst nightmare. Within minutes, Jacksonville Sheriff's Office patrol cars flooded Oak Street, their red and blue lights cutting through the humid darkness. Neighbors emerged from their homes, faces etched with concern and fear. In a tight-knit community like Riverside, a missing child was everyone's emergency. Detective Clara Jensen, who would become the lead investigator on Clara's case, arrived within 20 minutes. She immediately noticed troubling details. The window screen had been removed with precision, not torn or damaged. There were no signs of struggle in Clara's room. Most chilling of all, there were muddy footprints leading from the window across the hardwood floor, but they stopped abruptly at the bedroom door, as if whoever took Clara had carried her from that point. By dawn, over 50 officers were combing through the Timucuan preserve behind the Jensen house. K-9 units picked up Clara's scent leading into the dense Florida wetlands, but the trail went cold at a small creek about half a mile from her home. Search teams and airboats navigated the murky waters while helicopters thundered overhead, their spotlights sweeping across miles of sawgrass and cypress swamps. The community response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, missing person flyers with Clara's bright smile were posted on every telephone pole, storefront window, and church bulletin board in Jacksonville. Her school photo showed a gap-toothed grin and sparkling blue eyes that seemed to look right through you. The Amber Alert system, still relatively new in 2002, broadcast her description across North Florida. But as days turned into weeks with no trace of Clara, the initial surge of hope began to fade. The Jensen family held daily press conferences, Megan's voice growing more strained with each plea for her daughter's safe return. Dylan, barely a teenager himself, aged years in those first few weeks, carrying the weight of guilt for not being home to protect his sister. The investigation soon focused on a name that would divide the Jacksonville community: Jasper Stone. The 62-year-old lived alone in a rundown house just 4 blocks from the Jensens. He was unemployed, kept to himself, and had a habit of taking long walks through the neighborhood at odd hours. In neighbors' eyes, Stone fit the profile of someone who didn't quite belong in their family-oriented community. Stone had a minor criminal record, mostly trespassing charges from his younger days, and he'd been known to sit on park benches watching children play. When detectives knocked on his door 3 days after Clara disappeared, they found his house cluttered with old newspapers and empty bottles. Stone was cooperative but seemed nervous, stumbling over his words when asked about his whereabouts on August 15. Under intense community pressure and media scrutiny, the investigation began to center on Stone despite the lack of physical evidence. His alibi was weak. He claimed to have been home alone watching television, and 2 witnesses came forward saying they'd seen him walking in the direction of Oak Street on the night Clara vanished. The case against Stone built slowly but steadily. A search of his property turned up a shovel with what appeared to be fresh dirt, though forensic testing was inconclusive. More damning was the discovery of a notebook containing what prosecutors would later argue were obsessive writings about innocence lost and references to local children. If you're still with me, still listening to Clara's story, it means you understand that some cases stay with you long after the screen goes dark. These investigations shape communities, families, and our understanding of justice itself. I create these videos because I believe every victim deserves to have their story told completely and truthfully. If you feel the same way, please subscribe to Cold Crime Stories HQ and help me continue bringing these important cases to light. In March 2004, nearly 2 years after Clara's disappearance, Jasper Stone was arrested and charged with kidnapping and murder. The evidence was largely circumstantial, but in a community desperate for answers and closure, it felt like justice was finally within reach. The trial took place in Jacksonville's Duval County Courthouse, an imposing building that had witnessed decades of Florida's most serious criminal cases. The prosecution, led by Assistant State Attorney Michael Torres, painted Stone as a predatory loner who had been watching the Jensen family and struck when the opportunity arose. Jasper Stone represents every parent's worst nightmare, Torres told the jury during opening statements. A man who lurks in the shadows of our neighborhoods, watching our children, waiting for his chance. The prosecution's case relied heavily on witness testimony placing Stone near the Jensen house, and expert testimony about his psychological profile. Stone's defense attorney Maria Santos fought back aggressively. "You cannot convict a man based on suspicion and prejudice," she argued. "Being different, being a loner, being eccentric. None of these things make someone a killer. The state has not presented a single piece of physical evidence linking my client to Clara Jensen's disappearance." The trial lasted 3 weeks, with emotional testimony from Megan Jensen and Dylan, who was now 17 and struggling with severe depression. The community packed the courtroom daily, many wearing yellow ribbons for Clara. The pressure for a conviction was palpable. Despite the thin evidence, the jury deliberated for only 6 hours before returning a guilty verdict. Jasper Stone was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Outside the courthouse, the crowd erupted in cheers. Local news declared it a victory for justice, and the Jensen family expressed relief that Clara's killer had finally been punished. But for Megan Jensen, the verdict brought little peace. Clara's body had never been found, and without that closure, the wound remained open. Dylan struggled with substance abuse and dropped out of high school. The family's Oak Street house, once filled with laughter, became a shrine to a missing daughter. Years passed, and the Clara Jensen case faded from headlines. Jacksonville moved on, believing that justice had been served. But in the sterile confines of his prison cell, Jasper Stone maintained his innocence, writing letter after letter to anyone who would listen, insisting he had nothing to do with Clara's disappearance. The breakthrough that would change everything came not from new detective work or witness testimony, but from advances in forensic science that nobody could have predicted in 2002. In 2018, the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office received a federal grant to review cold cases using new DNA technology, specifically genetic genealogy, the same technique that had been used to identify the Golden State Killer. Detective Lisa Park, who had taken over the cold case unit, decided to take another look at the Clara Jensen file. Hidden in an evidence box that hadn't been opened in years was a single strand of hair that had been found on Clara's bedroom windowsill. In 2002, the hair couldn't be tested due to its poor condition, but new extraction techniques made it possible to develop a partial DNA profile. The hair didn't match Jasper Stone. More importantly, when run through genetic genealogy databases, it pointed to an entirely different family line. After months of painstaking research, building family trees and eliminating suspects, investigators identified a name that sent shockwaves through Jacksonville: Caleb Finch. Finch was 48 years old in 2002, married with 2 children, working as a maintenance supervisor at a Jacksonville hotel. He lived just 3 streets from the Jensen family and had never appeared on investigators' radar. Most disturbing of all, Finch had been one of the volunteers who helped search for Clara in the days after her disappearance. The investigation into Finch revealed a pattern of disturbing behavior that had been hidden for decades. Co-workers remembered him making inappropriate comments about young girls. His ex-wife, contacted by detectives, revealed that he had violent mood swings and would disappear for hours without explanation. Most chilling of all, employment records showed that Finch had taken vacation time from August 15 to 19, 2002, exactly when Clara disappeared. As investigators dug deeper into Finch's background, they discovered he had moved to Jacksonville just 6 months before Clara vanished, relocating from Georgia, where police had investigated him in connection with another child's disappearance. That case had gone unsolved, and Finch had never been charged. The evidence against Finch was overwhelming, but investigators needed more than genetic genealogy to build a prosecutable case. They began surveillance, hoping to obtain a fresh DNA sample to confirm the match. For weeks, they followed Finch to his job, to restaurants, to grocery stores, waiting for the perfect opportunity. That opportunity came when Finch visited a Starbucks near his workplace. After he left, investigators retrieved his coffee cup and had it rushed to the state crime lab. The results were conclusive. Caleb Finch's DNA was a perfect match for the hair found on Clara's windowsill. The arrest came on a quiet Tuesday morning in February 2019. Finch was at his current job, supervising maintenance at a downtown office building, when Jacksonville Sheriff's detectives surrounded him. Witnesses later described how his face went completely white when they read him his rights for the kidnapping and murder of Clara Jensen. The news of Finch's arrest sent shockwaves through Jacksonville and raised immediate questions about Jasper Stone's conviction. Stone, now 79 years old, and in poor health after 17 years in prison, was represented by the Innocence Project of Florida. Within weeks of Finch's arrest, Stone's attorneys filed a motion to overturn his conviction based on the new DNA evidence. The hearing to consider Stone's case was held in the same courthouse where he had been convicted nearly 2 decades earlier. The courtroom was packed with reporters, legal observers, and members of the Jensen family. Stone, now frail and using a walker, sat quietly as his attorney presented the DNA evidence that proved his innocence. Judge Patricia Williams didn't hesitate in her ruling. "Mr. Stone, on behalf of the state of Florida, I apologize for the grave miscarriage of justice you have endured," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "Your conviction is hereby vacated, and you are free to go." The moment was captured by news cameras. Stone, supported by his attorney, walking slowly out of the courthouse, a free man after losing 17 years of his life to a wrongful conviction. His first words to reporters were not about his own suffering, but about Clara Jensen. "I hope her family finally gets the justice they deserve." Meanwhile, as Finch awaited trial, investigators were following up on the most heartbreaking question of all. Where was Clara? A search of Finch's properties, including a storage unit he had rented in 2002, turned up disturbing evidence. Children's clothing that didn't belong to his own kids, photographs of local playgrounds, and a detailed map of the Timucuan Preserve with several areas marked in red ink. One of those marked areas led investigators to a remote section of wetland about 5 miles from the Jensen house. After days of careful excavation, they found what the family had been searching for since 2002. Clara's remains, buried in a makeshift grave and wrapped in a tarp that had preserved crucial evidence. The discovery brought the Jensen family the closure they had desperately needed, but also reopened wounds that had never properly healed. Megan Jensen, now in her 50s and remarried, broke down when detectives delivered the news. Dylan, who had struggled with addiction for years, finally entered rehab, saying he needed to get clean to honor his sister's memory. Clara's funeral was held on a beautiful spring day in 2020, 18 years after her disappearance. Hundreds of people attended, including many who had searched for her as a child. The service was both heartbreaking and healing, finally allowing Jacksonville to say goodbye to the little girl whose disappearance had haunted them for nearly 2 decades. Cases like Clara's remind us why this work matters, why we dig into these painful stories and refuse to let victims be forgotten. Every time someone watches, shares, or engages with these cases, you're ensuring that their voices continue to be heard. If Clara's story has moved you, please consider subscribing and sharing this video. Together, we can make sure that no victim is ever truly lost. Caleb Finch's trial began in September 2021, 19 years after Clara Jensen's murder. The evidence against him was overwhelming. DNA linking him to the crime scene, his presence in the volunteer search teams, his suspicious behavior and time off work, and most damning of all, physical evidence found at his burial site that could only have come from the killer. The prosecution, led by the same office that had wrongfully convicted Jasper Stone, approached this case with a determination to get it right. They presented a meticulous timeline of Finch's actions, showing how he had planned and executed Clara's abduction, then manipulated the investigation by joining the search efforts. Finch's defense team argued that the DNA evidence was contaminated, and that their client was being framed for a crime he didn't commit. But their arguments fell flat when faced with the mountain of scientific evidence. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. Judge Williams, the same judge who had freed Jasper Stone, sentenced Finch to death. "You stole not just Clara Jensen's life, but 17 years from an innocent man," she said during sentencing. "You manipulated a grieving community and participated in the very search for the child you murdered. There are no words adequate to describe the evil of your actions." The Clara Jensen case became a landmark in Florida criminal justice, leading to reforms in how missing children cases are investigated and highlighting the importance of advanced forensic technology. It also became required reading in law schools as an example of how bias and community pressure can lead to wrongful convictions. For Jasper Stone, now a free man but forever changed by his ordeal, the case represented both vindication and tragedy. He received a substantial settlement from the state of Florida, but often said that no amount of money could give him back the 17 years he lost or repair the damage to his reputation and relationships. Stone became an advocate for criminal justice reform, working with the Innocence Project to prevent future wrongful convictions. He often spoke to police academies and law schools about the importance of following evidence rather than assumptions, and the devastating consequences when the system gets it wrong. The Jensen family, meanwhile, found a measure of peace they hadn't known since 2002. Megan established a foundation in Clara's name to support families of missing children, and to fund DNA testing for cold cases. Dylan, now clean and sober, became a counselor specializing in trauma recovery, channeling his own pain into helping others heal. Clara's bedroom in the Oak Street house, which had been kept as a shrine for nearly 2 decades, was finally transformed into a home office for the foundation's work. But her memory lives on in the hundreds of cases the foundation has helped solve, and the families it has supported through their darkest hours. The investigation revealed that Finch had likely committed similar crimes in other states where he had lived. Cold case units in Georgia, Alabama, and South Carolina reopened files from the 1990s and early 2000s, looking for potential connections. While no additional charges were filed before his execution in 2023, investigators believe Finch was responsible for at least 3 other child disappearances. Today, if you drive through Jacksonville's Riverside neighborhood, you'll find a small memorial garden where Clara Jensen's elementary school once stood. The school was torn down years ago, but the city preserved the space as a reminder of the little girl who loved to read and dreamed of becoming a teacher. The garden features a reading bench surrounded by yellow roses, Clara's favorite color, and a plaque that reads, "In memory of Clara Jensen and all children whose voices were silenced too soon." May their stories inspire us to protect the innocent and seek justice for the voiceless. The Clara Jensen case reminds us that justice, though sometimes delayed, is not always denied. It shows us the power of scientific advancement to reveal truth that has been buried for decades, and the importance of never giving up on victims and their families. It also serves as a sobering reminder of the damage that can be done when investigations are driven by prejudice rather than evidence. Jasper Stone lost 17 years of his life because he was different, because he didn't fit the community's image of who belonged in their neighborhood. His wrongful conviction stands as a permanent reminder that in our rush to find answers and assign blame, we must never abandon the principles of justice and due process. For the Jensen family, Clara's case represents both an ending and a beginning. The ending of nearly 2 decades of uncertainty and pain. The beginning of a new chapter focused on healing and helping others. Megan often says that Clara would be proud of the work being done in her name, proud that her story continues to make a difference in the world. As we close Clara's story, we're reminded that behind every cold case is a family that never stopped hoping, a community that never forgot, and investigators who refused to give up. These cases matter not just because they bring killers to justice, but because they restore faith in our ability to find truth even in the darkest circumstances. Clara Jensen was 11 years old when she was taken from her bedroom on that humid August night in 2002. She loved to read, dreamed of becoming a teacher, and had her whole life ahead of her. While Caleb Finch stole her future, he couldn't steal her impact. Through the foundation that bears her name, through the reforms her case inspired, and through the other children who are safer because of lessons learned from her tragedy, Clara's legacy lives on. If this case has touched you, if you believe in the importance of never forgetting victims like Clara, please subscribe to Cold Crime Stories HQ. Your support helps ensure that these stories continue to be told, that victims are remembered, and that the pursuit of justice never ends. Thank you for listening, and remember, the truth may be buried, but it is never destroyed.